I actually want to point something out. So cold fusion is a great example of a concept that everyone was excited about. We get burned by it, and then that's it. It's over.
It's not over.
Oh.
That's part of the message. It is not over. That fixed idea is going to determine everything they think after that. And they're never going to be able to understand that you can have a physiological system that stores excess fat independent of how much you eat. And the only people they're reading are the Americans, who are saying it's gluttony and sloth. It's gluttony and sloth. Still in 1940, it's gluttony and sloth. We could disprove any other hypothesis. They pay no attention to the anomalous observations, because if you acknowledge the existence of those, your hypothesis looks shaky.
Tell me who you are and what you do.
Oh, my name is Gary Taubes. What I do, that's an interesting question. Maybe we should start this over again. Let me think about that. That's a tough question. No, I think of myself as a journalist still. So what I do is science, health, investigative reporting.
Now, I know if you're like me, you have almost a stock speech that tries to speed run and catch everybody up to what is already like a fairly robust background that got you to where you are now. What would you say is a good, 3-4 minute summary, if you could, of like the last couple decades, I guess 3 decades now, that spans your
4
work?
decades.
4 decades.
Depressing. It's 4.5. And I started as a science journalist. I had a background in physics and engineering and journalism, and then I went into science journalism, and then I went off to CERN, the big physics lab outside of Geneva, to write a book about a great breakthrough in physics. These guys, I was told by the physicists who ran this huge collaboration, that all they had to do was turn on their accelerator, get a little more data, nail it down, Nobel Prizes shower upon them. For some crazy reason, he let me embed myself with this collaboration for 10 months, and I watched them realize how they had, to use non-technical terminology, fucked up. And so I watched them basically learn how they had misinterpreted their data, some of the smartest physicists in the world, how they had screwed up, and I wrote a book about that. And I became obsessed with how hard it is to do science right, and how easy it is to get the wrong answer, basically. And I've been writing about that one way or the other for the past 40 years. So my second book was on cold fusion, which was this great scientific fiasco of the 1980s, and I got obsessed with it and interviewed 300 people, even though I knew it was wrong. Basically anyone who had any involvement in this subject I tried to talk to, and for as long as I could, as long as we could keep ourselves interested. That book was called Bad Science, and then after I was done with that, some of my friends in the physics community said, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at the stuff in public health, that it's terrible. And
before you get to that, I actually want to point something out. So cold fusion is a great example of a concept that everyone was excited about. We get burned by it, and then that's it. It's over.
It's not over.
Oh.
That's part of the message. It is not over. So it asymptotically approaches zero, basically. So as the size of the effect gets smaller and smaller. It's a fascinating study, again, in bad science, because you start off with the initial reports of cold fusion, which were totally bogus, but they were huge effects. They were talking about these cold fusion cells exploding in their laboratories, and then as the more and more researchers get involved who actually have experience in measuring what has to be measured in these experiments, which amusingly enough was calorimetry back then because you're measuring excess heat. Now it's calorimetry because you're measuring, the energy put off by a human body. But as the technology got better and better, and the researchers doing it were more and more educated, so as you actually got people who spent their lives doing calorimetry. So initially you have chemists and physicists who think they've discovered this nuclear phenomenon. They go, oh, well, we have to measure whether or not excess heat is running. So they run out and they buy the equipment necessary and they plug it into the wall and they run their cells and they see these pretty large effects because they don't know what they're doing. So then as they report large effects, people who do calorimetry for a living say, oh, well, this is fascinating. Let me see what I can find. And the better they were, the smaller the effect that could be ruled out. And so you have this effect size asymptotically approaching zero, but it never reaches zero. You can never prove something doesn't exist. There's always some error in the measurements. There's some, limit to the resolution of the technology. And there's always people who want to believe that they've discovered something new, or that there's this miracle technology out there that you could just throw some, heavy water in a glass with an electrode and plug it into the wall and create nuclear fusion. And so there's always willing to believe, and there's always shysters who will get involved and think, I could sell this to somebody for more money. I mean, about 5 or 10 years ago, Google put $5 million into assessment of whether there's any reality to cold fusion. It's like, just call me. I mean, for 1/100th of the price, I'll say no. 1/1000, say 10,000. It's going to take 10 minutes. Read the book. Anyway.
I guess I was going off of more. It wasn't in the headlines as much in the last, But what you're saying is it's still floating.
No, there's still people doing it. There's still people writing about it. It's no longer called cold fusion because the terminology changes as low temperature.
It's basically various ways of getting energy out of nearly nothing or nothing.
Yeah,
right, effectively, it's ways to defeat the first law of thermodynamics.
It's not. I mean, the laws of physics have to get tossed, but the laws of thermodynamics, I assume they're willing to keep that sacrosanct. Anyway, it's what made my perspective different than other science journalists and other scientists is my area of study is bad science. So
you were kind of spring-loaded for what was to come next in nutrition.
Yeah, and if you wanted to criticize or say, do I have a bias, you would say, I see bad science everywhere I look, whether it's there or not. But my perspective is I think I can recognize bad science, and I was mentored in my first 2 books by some of the best experimental scientists in the world because they were delighted with what I was doing. Turned out a lot of people didn't like the physicist who was running this collaboration in Geneva. So I could go around the world and visit Nobel laureates, and they would tell me all the ways he had screwed up his previous experiments. One of my favorite quotes from that period of time for people who say you have to trust the science. And I use this as an epigraph in one of the chapters. I went to Fermilab in Illinois. I met with Leon Lederman, who was the Nobel laureate physicist running Fermilab. Leon was kind of famous because if you told him a joke he hadn't heard, he would give you an interview. That was sort of the constraint. So I actually liked telling jokes back then. And Leon said to me that he liked to walk around the laboratory at night and talk to the graduate students because they hadn't learned to lie yet. It's like if you wanted to find out, and so by the time I did my cold fusion book, among the 300 people I talked to was every graduate student and technician I could find. And as I became a science journalist, I realized you don't want to talk to the principal investigator because the principal investigator is basically going to give you a public relations talk. I mean, some of them are very good and some of them won't, but you might get a different story if you talk to the technicians, the lower level scientists.
That's been my experience. For what it's worth, I usually state, oh, but I've talked to grad students that say, and it's almost like you're catching them on that cusp where they know just enough, but they're also learning the political ramifications of if they speak out of turn.
Well, and this was also the lesson in my first book. So I've got this physicist he's a Harvard professor. He teaches in Geneva. He's Italian. He was known as the Alitalia professor because he spent so much time in the air. Somebody once calculated that his average velocity was something like 130 miles an hour because he spent so much time flying between cities. A Machiavellian character, to use an Italian stereotype. Possibly a pathological liar, couldn't really believe anything. His conception of truth was whatever he could get you to believe that would benefit him. And he never should have invited me to the lab. That was the biggest mystery, because he should have known that he didn't have the discovery he thought he had. But when I got there, I realized there were two groups of physicists, basically. So there's 150 physicists on their collaboration, and there's a physicist and technicians who actually built this huge detector, the experiment itself, that you collide these particles from the atom smasher in the middle of the detector, and the particles explode, and the detector sort of takes a picture, more or less, of all the particles that emerge, and then you piece together, what it saw. And so the physicists who had actually been there to build the detector, that was just something they had thrown together right in the laboratory. They got a lot of money. It was a huge piece of equipment, but they knew that it couldn't be trusted. Yeah, they were skeptical of what they had done. I mean, it was this huge, I forget the term that this one physicist used, but it was sort of, they were wary of what they were seeing. But as this experiment became sort of the avant-garde of physics, everyone knew this was like the front lines of physics, a place to be. This Nobel laureate collected all these bright young physicists from Harvard and Stanford and Yale, and they came to work with him. And they hadn't built the machine. They were just there to analyze the data that the machine gave them. So they weren't skeptical. They thought that what they were analyzing on these huge computer screens, these beautiful pictures of particle collisions, were trustworthy. Whereas the other 140 physicists were worried. And the principal investigator, the guy who ran the group, didn't want to listen to the other 140 people because he saw them as naysayers. They were like nags, back then there was a very sort of sexist attitude even in science, and it was they were like the housewives who were always nagging him to get his act together, whereas these bright young kids out of Harvard were oh, gung-ho, let's claim our Nobel Prize. So you listen to the ones who agree with you, and you sort of, and there was a kind of evaporation of the experiment itself because the very best physicists got tired of fighting with them. So they left to go elsewhere. So the ones who are left behind are the ones who don't want to fight with them or are willing to go along. So you see how this urge to learn something new, to create something new, gets completely tainted by the politics and sociology of humanity, basically, that these are all humans, and that the people if you really want to know what the equipment can do, you got to talk to the people who built the equipment. And in epidemiology, a field I'm obsessed with, I've been writing a lot lately on my Substack, you have the equivalent of these detectors are these huge, they're called prospective cohorts, like the nurses' health study is the most famous, run out of Harvard, and the physicians' health study. So you put together 110,000 nurses and you send them surveys, questionnaires every couple of years, and they fill out the questionnaires about what they eat and their lifestyle and the drugs they take and their health status. And then from that, you try to detect associations. And once the cohort is put in place, like the detector is built, the cohort is your detector, then people can come and use the cohort who didn't build it. So they have no idea. They just have no idea that this is going to give them unreliable information. that what they think is an association between a disease and a dietary item is in reality an association between the disease and the kind of person who preferentially eats that item. And there's no way they can learn this, because the only people left who actually built it are the people who are so invested in it, who run the collaboration. They're not going to tell these people that they can't trust it. They've probably decided by now that there's no reason not to trust it. So the same kind of sociology plays into it. The end result is either bad science or a journalist who can only see bad science even when it's not there. So,
particularly if it's just not culturally common in the space that you're coming into, which I think kind of leads us into nutritional epidemiology, right?
No, I'm talking about nutritional epidemiology specifically.
Yeah, because this is the catch. One of the conversations I remember having with you very early on was I, had gone from college straight into software development, which is a little bit of touching on film. But in the course of doing that, I had only briefly passed through science for core curriculum. And as I'm getting this introduction with nutrition and nutrition science, I kind of didn't have the best opinion. And I'd actually asked you about this in particular, and you said, actually, there is strong science. You just have a bad entry point. And you brought up physics, that physics actually does tend to be a lot more about falsifiability, for example. And
It's interesting because software design is about falsifiability also. You have a hypothesis of how to write your software program, and then you write it, and if it doesn't work, you falsified your hypothesis.
And you go out of business potentially.
Yeah.
We build tests in our code. So we have lots of ways for new coming code to fail along the process.
Right.
And that's standard.
Yeah, and functioning sciences, and my thinking on this has evolved over the years. It's hypothesis and tests. That's the simplest way to think of it. And the easier it is to do the tests and the cheaper it is to do the tests, the more functional the science, because the more people you'll have doing the tests, the less time there will be between the hypothesis and the test, so the less time people have to get invested emotionally and cognitively in the hypothesis. And so fields like physics work really well, and at one point I wanted to write a whole book about this, and one of the people I interviewed was this guy Richard Garwin, who actually worked at IBM, but was renowned in the physics community as being one of the smartest people in the world. Like Garwin did his graduate training with Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago, and Fermi, famous as being this brilliant physicist, called Garwin the only true genius he ever knew. And then Garwin went to Los Alamos and helped build, if I remember correctly, the hydrogen bomb with Edward Teller over a summer vacation. Okay, he was a student there, and they had a problem with the design, and Garwin solved it for him. And then it got to the point, he worked as a physicist at Columbia for like 20 years, and then he moved into IBM, where he got this emeritus position where he could do anything he wanted, basically. And I had met physicists at CERN who said they wouldn't design an experiment without talking to Garwin about it first, because Garwin would tell them how it was wrong. And I interviewed Garwin when he was already in his 90s. He may or may not be still alive. He said, he described a new experimental result coming out, a new theory coming out on Friday with experimental evidence for it, and him talking to his colleagues and going into the lab on the weekend and scavenging the equipment they needed from the lab to do the test by Monday to see if they could confirm it. And that's science at its best. When you can do that, you could quickly get rid of, like your software program that has built-in tests in it. You can get rid of the incorrect ideas very quickly. And you have to make sure that you don't kill something that's viable by accident. But, because you can always get the wrong result with an experiment. You could always do the experiment incorrectly. You could misinterpret what you see. That's why you need independent confirmations, even of negative results. But in fields like nutrition and, climate change is the obvious example, and even, you get into COVID issues of all these things where there are huge controversies, it's because you can't really test the hypotheses. And so people get invested in the hypotheses, like low-fat diets will prevent heart disease, or, saturated fat raises LDL, which will cause heart disease. And it's just too damn hard to do the experiments. And when they do the experiments, there's the pressure. They spend so much money and there's so much effort into doing them. The pressure to get a positive result is so profound. Like, one of the amusing things now, I wrote my last book, Rethinking Diabetes. And I talked about all these, the diabetes community, to their credit, likes to test their hypotheses. The problem is they test them and the hypotheses fail the test. So the tests fail to find evidence in support of the hypotheses. And if you go to like the NIH website, which I did while writing my books, and the NIH funded these tests, you wouldn't actually realize that the test was negative. Because what they do is they talk about all the good things the test did, because they're got to justify having spent the money. They don't want to talk about the fact that ultimately it failed to find evidence for one of the dominant hypotheses in the field for the past century. And I understand the temptation, but it's tragic for the progress of science, because...
Yeah, absolutely, because of course you can't help but feel cynical if the nature of the funding had an expectation of a promissory outcome for what it was designed to be confirmed. Like, it should be a good thing when we run a big experiment and we get findings, whatever the findings are, that it informed us better. If you're basically saying, well, I just don't want to accept this result that's not working out for me, or at least I want to try to cherry pick within the data something that still confirms what I was setting out to prove, as opposed to accepting those things that it's actually providing evidence against.
Yeah, yes, I agree with you, and yet it's always more complicated. Trying to think of, say, the best examples.
I think in a previous interview, for example, you brought up Women's Health Initiative.
Well, the Women's Health Initiative is, even that's kind of a classic. But the idea is, so you can go back to the 1960s, the first time that you had this cholesterol hypothesis, and the idea was that saturated fat raised cholesterol, and that led to heart disease and premature life. And so the research community and the public health community knew they had to test that. And they did a preliminary national heart study at various sites to see if they could get people to change their diets, and they decided they could. And then after another decade had gone by, by the end of the 1960s, they had put together an expert committee to discuss the need for this study and whether it should be funded. And they said absolutely it's necessary to know if this cholesterol fat hypothesis is true, but nonetheless they recommended against funding it. At the time it was assumed it would cost in the neighborhood of $1 billion, and they wouldn't be able to trust the result, because you can never trust the result of any one experiment, so then you got to replicate it. So how many experiments, again, if the experiments are cheap and they're easy to do, you can do this thing where you can asymptotically approach. Is that the term that anyone outside of who didn't have a math education in college? Asymptotically means it slowly approaches some, baseline number. So as I described in cold fusion, the more experiments you did, the smaller the effect got, and the closer and closer it got to zero, but it never reaches zero. But you keep doing experiments because you never know if the previous experiment was right or not. And maybe there's a small effect that is real, and you don't know when you're going to reach that. So if in an ideal science, like Einstein comes up with this theory of relativity, and 140 years later there are still people designing tests of it, because they're still hoping to find areas of energy or whatever in which it no longer holds, and then they could figure out how it has to be improved or revised. It wasn't like Arthur Eddington, this famous British scientist, came along, did one test, and everyone said, Eureka, Einstein's right from here on in. I mean, it was a very good sign, and eventually we accepted that this theory worked, but you keep doing the experiments.
But I think this goes back to, I believe it's Karl Popper who's saying, you never prove a hypothesis correct.
True,
you can only disprove it.
You can only refute it. So, and if you refute it, you got to be sure that your refutation is actually correct. Right. So you got to refute it 2 or 3 times, ideally. Some number of times before you can say, okay, this is just not worth it anymore. Even if it's true, it's not worth it. We got to find a better hypothesis. So there's all these, as soon as you get into the world of nutrition and the studies cost like $50, $100 million to do right, how many are you going to do? And if you do one and you kind of sort of see something that supports your original belief, there's going to be a real profound motivation to say, let's, if we push that a little bit, we could say this supports the hypothesis. Let's just do that. And hopefully we'll get more money to do it again, do this test again. But even if we don't, this is a very important hypothesis, right? If people should avoid fat to minimize their heart disease risk, do we really want to throw that out because we might not have done the experiment correctly? Or we couldn't get people to stick to their diets well enough, or the people in the control group ate too much. So it gets to the point where it's a sort of limits of science issue.
There is an interesting angle to this, though, which obviously relates back to my work. We have this rise of something that would have seemed unimaginable 20, 30 years ago, which is a kind of natural experiment where you have a bunch of people who not only are increasing their saturated fat, their total fat by 10, 20%, they're living exclusively on fat. They're quite literally fat adapted to where you've got this huge magnitude of change. And because there's such a huge magnitude of change, it suggests that with, per statistics, you don't need as large of a sample size.
Right.
And this obviously comes into play with us because we're also seeing high LDL cholesterol with the phenotype that's central to my research with lean mass hyperresponders. That isn't just, a 20 or 30% increase, but multiples.
Right.
Would we then at least be able to apply principles of Bradford Hill for, say, strength as to the sheer quantity increase? Theoretically, we can because because Brown and Goldstein were doing that themselves with a tiny population of homozygous FH patients, saying, this clearly proves it because they have no other known risk factors save the sky-high LDL. That's meaningful coming at these experiments with regard to diet, because usually these dietary experiments, as you well know, with epidemiology, they're parsing together very tiny magnitudes of difference between like consuming one food or another, and then trying to use statistical instruments to account for the causality of all other things so that they can try to make a claim of causality there.
Yes, but again, and we've talked about this off air, there are issues with, let's say you see exactly what you expect to see. And I am so jaded that I assume everyone will eventually see exactly what they expect to see, whether it's real or not, and that's what people accuse me of, and they're perfectly right to do it. It doesn't mean I'm doing, the issues will be, it's a self-selected population, so you don't know if the people who choose to eat this way are different to begin with. And because it's not randomized, and randomization takes care of that self-selection, spreads the difference out equally between the two groups, whatever that difference is. And maybe at this level, it's just not relevant to the rest of the theory. So if you want to say this is, for people who are fat adapted or living on ketogenic diets, the LDL is meaningless. It's not driving atherosclerosis, and that's a valid conclusion from your work, but does that really speak to the rest of the world, saturated fat for people who are not? And you really have no idea because, I mean, it could. Does it speak to this whole LDL theory? Well, once you get into theory like that, that gets even more complicated. You're going to argue that your theory best explains all the data, which is what you want a theory to do, is sort of have maximal explanatory power. But,
I think you want to get maximal explanatory power in comparison to others. But as with all models, it's what the prevailing explanation is, knowing that all models are wrong, right?
Yeah. And that's true. But again, the people who have embraced the other model, well, they won't come along. Well, it's just not what humans do.
It's true.
So then the question is, I've had this discussion with our friends who have been arguing about the dangers of statins, or the lack of benefit of statin therapy, the spectrum of beliefs there. If you look at why we've made progress with low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diets, it's because people with symptoms of some chronic disease can self-experiment and eat this way and improve, put their symptoms into remission. And usually they're people, by the time they get to keto or carnivore or just low carb, they're people who have done the conventional wisdom. They might have even done vegan diets and vegetarian diets, but for at least until very recently, they would have done low-fat diets for years, realizing they've just gotten sicker and sicker, and then you could self-experiment. So you could get sort of personal experience that refutes the conventional wisdom, and you could convert people. And so we converted people who basically, because physicians have these same issues, so they'll try it eventually. Researchers will try it, academics will try it, bureaucrats will try it. If somebody tries it, like if I'm talking to someone about my ideas, I think I can get to them if they're overweight or obese. If they're thin, naturally it's like no fucking way. There's just no experience this person could have that could get him to or her to shift their belief system based on my logic, because they're going to see the world differently than I am. They're going to see my examples differently. They're going to see my logic differently. And we can talk about this because I have some fascinating examples. As soon as you get to things regarding prevention, that's a different world, because you can't see a disease being prevented.
Well, definitely when it comes to cardiovascular disease, it's of a special new level of difficulty to detect prevention.
Yeah, you could detect changes in particle size and lipids, and in theory, the calcium deposits
because it's
in the
less
arteries.
invasive relative to CT angiography, for example.
But for people's lives, it's like if you go on a statin and you've got this guy over here saying that's a mistake and you're going to increase your risk of heart disease or some kind of side effect, and this guy saying, you got to do that because otherwise you're going to have a heart attack. 5 years later, you have no idea who's right, regardless of what happens to you.
Unless you run an experiment in that case.
I'm just saying from a personal, I've got, for instance, Peter Attia tells me I should be on a statin because I got high LDL, and Dave Feldman tells me I don't.
Wait.
Okay.
Okay.
David Diamond says I should.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. I like and respect both these people.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right.
I choose not to. 5 years from now, I have a heart attack. Was Peter right? I don't know. Was David right? I don't know, maybe I had the heart attack anyway. And if 5 years later I have had no heart attack, or 10 years or 20 years, is Peter right? I don't know. Because there's no, a counterfactual. There's no comparator. If I live to be 90 without heart disease, who was right? No idea. Because I have no way, maybe I'd have lived to be 95.
Well, but this is the problem with anecdotal data generally, right?
Except if you've got symptoms. If you're treating symptoms, by symptoms, overweight, obesity, high blood pressure, poor blood sugar control, now anecdotal experiments, I mean, it's true, like, let's say you go on a ketogenic diet, you lose 50 pounds. Okay, everything improves except your blood pressure improves, your blood sugar control improves, your A1C comes down, your LDL goes up. But the point is, it's possible that was a coincidence, that you would have lost the 50 pounds even if you had kept eating. But we're willing to, you can use yourself as a control. It's never happened. Since it's possible you'd have lost the 50 pounds on any diet, which is likely. But you have experiences with all the other diets, and it never was as easy. It was a different experience. So you can be pretty confident that you've put your overweight into remission with this ketogenic diet. Will it stay in remission? Yeah, hope so, but you don't have that evidence yet. So that's a different thing than, did you extend your life because you raised your LDL, or you lowered your LDL, or you changed your LDL, you lowered your A1C, and you lowered your blood sugar, blood pressure, and you lowered your weight, and these are all risk factors for heart disease. Your LDL went up, and your HDL went up, and your triglycerides went down. These are all risk factors, that are going, except for the LDL, in the right direction. Are you going to live longer? That information is not given to you. Okay? You have no idea. It's sort of, you hope so, because so many good things have happened. But so you get information, you change your diet, you put your disease into remission. That information is pretty reliable. Like I said, it's always a possibility it's a coincidence, or the moment you changed your diet, you actually simultaneously got cancer and you lost 40 pounds because of the cancer, not the diet. That's always possible.
But definitely aside from LDL, there seems to be broad agreement by everybody, even people who want to lower LDL, at this point in time, that metabolic health is a higher risk factor. This isn't to say that it needs to be mutually exclusive or et cetera, but at a minimum, I think that there's some broad agreement on that front. Then the question follows,
Except from all the doctors who have been brainwashed to only see LDL as the only, they're like, basically that's their job. Do a lipid panel, put people with high LDL on statins.
That's actually true. And actually, to be fair, I feel like I already have to kind of walk that cat back, because almost immediately I'm thinking of a number of doctors, for example, online, who insist, including some we know between us, who would insist if you get ApoB low enough, you don't have heart disease, even in those who are full-blown metabolic syndrome.
Which is quite possible.
It's possible, but I've yet to see any sizable data, even in the trials where they've got very intensive PCSK9, that actually eliminates heart disease.
And I remember in New York Times, Gina Colada wrote about this, and I forget what drug it was, but it's, even in people with low LDL, it reduced heart disease risk. And you look at the numbers, and it was reduced. She said it was a 25% reduction in risk because she was using relative risk instead of absolute risk. It was like 26% down to 22%. Which is like, I'm going to I do this dramatic thing to my body to reduce, and the way I like to think of it is, it means for every 100 people with this LDL cholesterol, 22 of them are going to have a heart attack regardless, right? And 74 are going to not have a heart attack regardless of what they do, and 4 will prevent a heart attack. And is that something, again, having been a poker player for all these years, do I care about that 4% increase in absolute risk? And I don't.
Here's the problem, though. I'm always cautious when approaching this topic, because there is a difference between talking about the lipid hypothesis in general,
right,
and then talking about the treatment against it. The second actually gets way more emotional pushback, and I understand, because these are clinicians who are recommending to their patients, here's what you need to do to save your life, right? I will say, I want to be able to just state this without it being even about statins or anything.
Right.
Broadly, I don't like data that comes from powering against events, generally.
Powering.
Powering for events. In other words, once it reaches a statistical significance, they stop it right there. Even if it's planned for 3 years, they stop it at 1.9. Why?
Right.
Because they say, well, now it would be unethical for us not to get the placebo group onto the same.
Yeah, no,
but,
I know.
But the problem is, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, you've got an issue in that had you gone the full 3 years, it might have lost its statistical significance because of the variability.
Well, this is one reason I've always thought all scientists should be poker players, because then they would have a much better understanding of how statistical fluctuations actually play out in real life.
Because to use the poker analogy, I hit my flush 3 of the last 5 times. But I know hitting my flush is actually a 35% chance. Right. And I only know that because I know exactly what the statistical likelihood is.
But it's also, it's not just knowing the odds. And you had much more experience, played much more regularly than I did. But I moved from LA to New York. I moved from a home game I played in LA and the casinos to, home game in New York, an office game actually, because you're playing in someone's office, and the illegal poker clubs. And I lost pretty much consecutively for a year. And I spent that year trying to figure out what I had done differently. So this is, say, 2 games a week for a year. I used to win consistently, and then I suddenly lost consistently. Are they better poker players in New York? And at the end of the year, if you'll pardon my expression, my luck changed. If I had 2 pair, I went back to making full houses. If I had a pair, I went back to making trips. If I had 4 to a flush, I just, nothing changed in how I played. And I was ripping myself, like, what am I doing differently? And for a year, I tried different experiments, I couldn't change. And then at the end of the year, I went back to winning. It's like I had a year-long statistical fluctuation as far as I could tell. And it was unfortunate, but it was a learning experience, and you can have a 2-year. And this was one of the lessons, actually, that came out of cold fusion. It was really interesting because...
If I could interject just this one piece, exactly what you're describing is what almost everybody who plays the game does, because we're wired to try to assess things on a per-session basis. So you play a session of, say, 4 hours of poker, which is a decently long session for that. It's the statistics, if you look carefully, somewhere in the neighborhood of around 2,000 hours that you've got to play completely consistently for all of the odds of the times where you're like chasing certain cards and where they draw out to actually get even anywhere close to equalizing. So every time you're chasing a particular hand based on the cards you have in your hand versus others, that's when you see it. But we're not wired that way.
Right.
So it could have been it could be true that you didn't change your behavior at all, and then all of a sudden it looked like your luck had changed.
Absolutely.
When in reality it was just evening out in the same fashion that you could play slots here in Vegas, 5 nights in a row, and you're like, I just can't lose.
Right.
I seem to be good at slots. But if you stayed longer...
Well, and we all knew poker players who thought like that until their luck changed. But when I say I tried like I was trying to, I was trying to step outside of myself to figure out what am I doing differently while this was happening. And every time you go to the game, you're thinking, okay, this is the day my luck's going to change. But clearly, if I'm losing, my psychological state is going to be different than if I'm winning. So it's almost impossible to play the same way. I assume at your level you have to.
Yeah,
but at my level, it's still an amateur by any definition of the word. It's just. But I'll tell you, at the end of the year, my luck changed. It's just, it's like I just went back to hitting hands again.
Yeah.
And, during that year, it's like I just wasn't happening. I would have to desperately bluff my way through, which again is probably, they might have had tells. I played with people who I knew, kind of terrified me because I thought that they could dominate me, which is a horrible place to be when you're playing poker. And because I thought that, it was probably true, whether they knew it or not, and they probably did. Anyway, we should talk about science and heart disease. Just for listeners, I didn't realize Dave was a poker player at the level
Oh, yeah.
he
So-
was. And
So to level set it for people, when you came in, there's some pictures we have on the wall because we're next to what used to be my poker table room. So there was like a poker table that was over there that's in the center, but we've now turned it into a workspace. But still have the framed images up when I was playing the main event of the World Series of Poker, something I would always see if I could win my way into. And I won my way into it like 8 times. And it's always fun because there's occasionally a guest who comes who themselves has played poker. And
8 times out of how many attempts?
8. Like it's winning when you're okay. So
Well, you say you had to win the satellites. To
yeah,
win the
you have to
money.
win the satellites. So you play a series of satellites. There's usually a budget that I'll start with that's much smaller than what it costs to get into the main event. And actually, I have a way to bring this back to science here in a second. I would allocate a certain number of days that I would play, and then I would play these satellites or single table events. So what that is it's like a tournament in a single table, and only one person can win. But as it starts narrowing down, as more people get knocked out, and it comes down to like 2-3 players, they can do what's called a chop, which is to say you make an agreement with each other based on the chips you have to basically split what the winnings are. And there's some game theory behind that, because do you really want to take the risk, or do you want to even it out over the total number of games you both are playing, these satellites, so that you both can just say, well, I'll take the equity position where I'm at right now. Right. Now, that's great for you as a player. That's also great for the casino because they don't have to pay the dealers as long when that deal is kind of worked out. And so it's one of those places where everyone seems to win enough. Mm-hmm. But occasionally you do have somebody like how you just described who's like, no, I'm on fire. I'm confident that I'm going to win because I won the last 3 out of the 4 times I played satellites. And in their mind, they're not really connecting the equity of the position that they're in to take the next step. But the problem is that when you're operating in that fashion, you can lose and get knocked out. Right. And then keep thinking back to how that happened. So I find I've been able to win 8 out of 8 times to get into the main event because there are enough players like that step out of the norm and usually don't value their equity position well enough, and I just have to make the right decision in that case to not devalue mine. So by the same token, when I was wanting to get into this, science of cholesterol, I was looking to see how much this larger hypothesis was categorical, and it's unmistakably categorical. There is the present lipid hypothesis is supposed to be that no population that has high LDL could possibly be low risk. It's just, there's no way that could be the case. It is the central driver of atherosclerosis, full stop. And so everything that you said earlier is 100% correct. This is a first study of its kind that's actually looking prospectively at a population that's has sky-high LDL and ApoB, but otherwise low risk across everybody. Absolutely true. There's going to be a whole bunch of people that are like, well, that doesn't mean much to me. And besides, it's only one study. But the key component is that it needed to be prospective, because as these patient pools expand, including a number of lean mass hyperresponders that are going to be under these different doctors everywhere. For that same reason, we look for the patterns that confirm our biases. There's going to be more and more case reports or case series even that say, hey, lean mass hyperresponders actually are at high risk. After I've chatted with this doctor over here, and so forth, we found 15 patients that are lean mass hyperresponders that have this problem. And I would not doubt them just because there's no population that's truly free of cardiovascular disease risk. They all have it. So to your point with yourself, yeah, the world will pay attention as to when Gary Taubes, if Gary Taubes has like a heart attack, as to when it happened. And if it's much later than expected, they'll be like, well, you're kind of like the smoker who smoked 3 packs a day and just happened to get away with it.
There's no way to tell. I mean, it's interesting because you just described a situation in which you could refute your hypothesis.
Right.
But
if the study, so as we're recording this, this will probably come out much later, but in just a few days' time, on the 7th, our paper, the plaque begets plaque, ApoB does not, is the culmination of this study. Did
you show this to Alan Snyderman, who we've talked about?
Yeah, we haven't showed it yet.
Why are you waiting?
Well, I have to get clearance now from a number of people. There's a huge PR team that's now connected with the documentary.
See, this is what worries me, okay? And again, in any area. So Alan Snyderman, it's interesting because even the whole theory of LDL, when I was reporting good calories, bad calories, I mean, there were people believe that LDL, caused atherosclerosis, but anything beyond that about what LDL's doing, the mechanism, I mean, the theory was based on like 4 people thinking about it, as far as I could tell back then. So it was Ron Krauss, Alan Snyderman, a few other people were actually thinking about what these particles are doing and why they're doing and why this might lead to atherosclerosis. But Alan Snyderman was always there. He was always one of the thoughtful people involved. So I introduced you to Alan. You've been communicating with him. Before I publish this, I would want to know what he thinks. Okay? Because once you publish it, you're invested. Now you're committed. Now you get your public relations team. Now if he makes a good point, it's much harder to say, oh, geez, that's a good point. We should have taken that into account, or we should have put a caveat there, or maybe that.
I should unpack the whole thing, because it's not just the PR team. I'm just mentioning that
I know. You've got collaborators. You've got a whole group of people.
By the PR team, I'm referring to, for example, the Lundquist Institute in collaboration with donors with regard to the study itself, a number of people that are invested across the board. Because it's coming out in a few days anyway, I'm not only anxious to get it in his hands, I want to be chatting with him.
And I completely get it. But my point is, and this, you see this happen throughout science, is you want the most thoughtful people to comment before, it's still in the oven. It's still in the oven.
Yes.
Yeah, like when I wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, I interviewed, 600 people for this book, or at least 600 for the 3 major articles that I did that led into it, and then the book itself. I forget which of those is correct, but in the course of 600, a lot of those were, most of them, 95% of them, or 8% were conventional wisdom people, because there was no alternative hypothesis. So then there wasn't, it was like there were 6 doctors in the world prescribing keto diets like Atkins and Eads and a few other people, and they'd all written books about it. And then when I got the manuscript done, and the manuscript was enormous, it was like 400,000 words. I picked, 10 of these people who I thought were the most thoughtful of the conventional wisdom people. And I asked them to read the manuscript, and I said, I want you to treat it like it's the first draft of a PhD thesis from your most annoying student, okay? Because they do nothing beneficial at all if they tell me it's good. That doesn't help me one iota. What I need to know is what's wrong with it. And even with that, I thought that would constitute fact-checking for me, and it didn't. But I was trying to make sure, and then the book, even with that, is full of caveats. It's like you could make that 500-page book, you cut it by 100 pages if you just took out all the weasel words, the may apparently be's and the could seemingly be, and it's possible that.
I do that quite a bit myself.
Yeah, well, you've got to.
Yeah,
because that's. You don't know, so you've got to. But anyway, so that's just my issue is you got to get the criticism before you publish, because once you publish, then you defend yourself. That's human nature.
Here's my polite pushback. A, there's so many people involved currently, way more than I can. I should show you my calendar after this and how many different meetings I have, how many email threads are going on around this paper. And if I could chart it over time, it's been like exponentially growing. And not just in my defense, but I'm going to bread in a little bit of a critique here. I started, I'm not going to call them out, but I started in 2017 when shortly after you and I had that our first meeting in that bar at Low-Carb San Diego, I believe.
Yeah.
I was emailing. I was wanting to show up at Jacksonville, Florida, where the NLA was. I was wanting to. They're going to
so
many people I was trying to connect with. There's a very famous podcast with a mutual friend of ours where I was wanting to get this. And there's so many times where not only was I knocking on their door and getting pushback, there's a handful of times where I got burned, where I did trust people with very sensitive information, with what I was doing, even including them in the process. And it didn't go well. Now, I won't say that that's the majority. I'll say it's a tiny fraction. But from that, especially when it comes into new relationships, I'll concede there's a degree with which my being burned previously makes me even more reluctant in the off chance that this becomes a new problem and a new headache that I just don't have the bandwidth for.
And I completely agree. I mean, I understand that. The same thing.
You might even understand it better than most people, given.
Well, and I've also the same thing has happened to me, and it's, what I could do with good calories, bad calories, before people knew what I was, before I had a reputation and a perspective that challenged people's thinking. I can't do it now. Now they won't read my stuff. It's like I ask them to, and occasionally I do, but it's, so I have a few readers who I trust to be, I know are critical thinkers, and I know can be assholes when necessary, which is what is necessary when you're doing this for people.
But I'm already coming at it from a different approach than most, because I'd said this from day one in putting this together. I want to capture and report.
Yeah.
I want to really just report the measurements. I wanted to get a varied team where we had different hypotheses going in. Again, something you're familiar with. To just agree on the protocol for the measurements. And I'd said from day one, I actually don't want to have that much interpretation, wherever it lands. Yeah. I want to just mainly get the aggregates.
Although your title.
Well, but that wasn't my title. And it is accurate. It is actually.
But anyway, the point is, I completely understand that it's true in a lot of science. Like if you have something new, you don't want to share it with your competitors or your critics because you want to get it out there. You want people to notice. If you share it in advance, they might leak it. They might.
That's not my reluctance, though.
Yeah. But once you go public, once it's out there, all these other human factors kick in, including defending what you've done. And you see, so instead of trying to refute your own hypothesis, you start to defend your own hypothesis.
But all of that should be done before we started. Like the design is something that you should be very upfront about. So after the data are collected, the only place for there to be robust argument is the methodology in play afterwards that was not determined in advance, right? So if I were king of the world, Gary, this is what I would do. I would make it to where every single study would have to register in advance what their hypothesis was and what their methodology was, and negotiate with whoever the journal was going to be that would publish it in advance before they started the experiment, that they were going to get published in that.
That's a good idea.
And then it's not even my idea. It's the best way to do this, because then you say, okay, well, whatever the results are, positive or negative, you guys are gonna publish it? Okay, good. And then basically it's on rails. Of course you're gonna come up with new and interesting things that you want to report that are beyond the major endpoints that you specified, but you still have to put out the major endpoints that you specified in advance, right? And if you're abandoning it, you should be on public record as to why. and it should be a reasonable case. And if culture shifted to that, I think we'd have great science all around. But currently, it's becoming the opposite direction. It seems it's more and more about having a conclusion when you start, getting the data, then determining a lot of the methodology post hoc.
Well, back 20, 30 years ago, I don't know if this is still true, but a lot of the researchers I would interview would actually, before they put in a grant to the NIH, they would do the experiments with the money they had from their previous grant, so they knew what they were going to find, so they could put in a grant proposing to do these experiments, because to continue getting funded, you need to get positive results, right? You refute your hypothesis.
Which is just wrong.
That's the end.
It's wrong.
It is, and it's a difficult problem to solve, but
I put this on the culture of science itself. Scientists, including the editors here at the journals, they should be the most vocal. They should be the most supportive about wherever the findings take us. It's part of the process of discovery.
Yes, absolutely. But again, it's sort of, I don't know if you remember this or where at the end of Good Calories, Bad Calories in the epilogue, I say, I have a paragraph where I say I never use, if you'll notice, I rarely use the word scientist to describe anyone in the book doing this research in this sort of, field of nutrition, obesity, chronic disease research, because they don't function as scientists as I understand the meaning of the word, and the few times I do use it, it's because those people did. And they were interested in rigorously testing their hypotheses. They were interested in rigorously interpreting the evidence in a way that avoided bias and accepting negative evidence as mean. I mean, there's a whole slew of things, and being relentlessly honest about bending over backwards, as Feynman put it, to sort of be honest about all the ways that their experiments might have deceived them and the misinterpret. I mean, in the ideal world, there's always a limitations paragraph in every paper. And it used to be the limitations section would be like a page and a half long, and it would be just this list of all the reasons that the researcher knew you should be critical of what he had published, and hoping that he had gotten everything, because God, the worst thing in the world is to have missed something and have somebody else point it out. And now it's like a single paragraph in which they have sort of one limitation, then they explain why it's not meaningful, and then they
Right.
segue into the strengths of the study, and that's it. And it's like, this is crazy. This isn't science as I understand it to work. The idea of a functional science. So anyway, I have faith, and I look forward to reading the paper, and I didn't mean to. But again, I just, part of the process of science going wrong is as soon as you publish something, you become committed to it. As soon as it's out there. And it used to be, like when I grew up in the physics community, it was interesting, so you're running an experiment, you see something interesting that your theory, an anomalous observation that your theory doesn't explain. So you try to figure out how you screwed up, in your lab, and if you can't figure out how you screwed up to explain this, then you start giving seminars. So you give a seminar at the laboratory, you give a seminar in the department, the university, you travel around and every time you give a seminar, you're basically saying, look, we saw this thing we can't understand, and it's probably a mistake, but we can't figure out what the mistake is. And eventually you get to the point where somebody either points out, oh, well, you didn't calibrate your Who's-Its device correctly, and you plugged it into a 110 volt outlet, and it should have been a 220 volt outlet. And if you do that, that'll take care of it. So you go back and you do the experiment, you plug it into the other outlet, and your effect goes away. And you go, well, that was it. Back to square one. If nobody can explain it, then eventually you write a paper that says observation, anomalous observation at 1.6 trillion electron volts, question mark. Because what you're saying is, we saw this, we can't explain it, but surely we fucked up. We just can't figure it out. No one else has explained it yet either. And now, ideally, other people will go and look, because you tell them exactly what to look for. And if they find the same thing, that means it's not, however you screwed up, it's not specific to your laboratory or your device, because it's reproducible. But until you get to that point, there's always this, just tell us how we screwed up and let us get on with our life. There's a famous example in physics, Sam Ting's. It's got an experiment, MIT physicists, he's got an experiment at Brookhaven, and they're upping the energy in this atom smasher, and they see this enormous effect. Bradford Hill criteria. The first thing, the effect is enormous. It's like you're turning the dial on an old-fashioned radio in the car, and you get to it's static, 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 and then boom, you've got this perfectly clear, radio station coming in that nobody shouldn't be there. And because it's so damn huge, Sam sits on it for 6 months trying to figure out how he screwed up. Trying to figure out what the hell is it that's producing this anomalous peak that's enormous. And during that 6 months, I get visitors from the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center at Stanford on the other coast. They hear the rumor of this effect and the size of it, and they go back and they turn on their accelerator and they see it also. And now Sam has to rush to get his paper into print simultaneously with the Stanford paper. And the particle that was discovered is called the J-psi particle, okay? And psi was the name that the Stanford people gave it. J is a Chinese character for king. And he had to share the credit because he spent 6 months refusing to believe that what he saw was real and refusing to, there was nothing worse than publishing a bogus effect, embarrassing yourself. And none of that exists in medicine or public health or nutritional epidemiology or cholesterol. It's like, get an effect, publish it, right? You got students who they need papers, grad students who want to
publish
become
or perish.
We need funding. It's all gone, that kind of, I see Sam as a hero in this story, even though he paid for it.
Right.
Sam once told me I can talk about Sam like I knew him well. I interviewed him 3 times.
One of my problems being in this space is that I get seduced by that, credit aspect. Like I want to be credited for the work that I've done, given how much time I put into it. However, it's somewhat at odds with what I'm used to in the culture of software development. Because in software development, of course, there's some degree of credit, but it's usually internal. Right. It's usually it from within your team. There's this meme I love, which is it's 4 panels and it says designers in the top half of it, and one designer is going, "Oh, I was just it was my own idea. I was just kind of inspired by some things you were doing," and then the other designer goes, "No, you stole it," and she's like crying. And then in the bottom panel, it's 2 Chads looking back and forth, and one Chad goes, "Hey, I stole your code," and then the other Chad goes, "It's not my code." And it's kind of immediately those of us who program know it's because so often we are building on each other's code. Right. In the same way, science is often you're connecting the dots of the people before you, and maybe you found a groundbreaking experiment that got you partway there, but then over here some other team came up with an experiment, and this other team came with an experiment, and that helped you connect a few more dots but they were after you did yours. So at some point, yes, there's this rush were it not for that huge desire for positive findings, then there wouldn't be this rush to only get in that direction. For example, why aren't there, or are there Nobel Prizes for disproving something that's been like a long common axiom? I actually don't even know the answer to this question.
Well, yeah, that gets tricky because it's sort of with every discovery that's accepted as an explanation for some phenomenon, by its acceptance is sort of refutation of all the other possible explanations.
Well, let me just say I would love for there to be such a thing. I'd love if there was a prize for the Nobel Prize for disproving a long-held belief.
Well, yeah, that gets complicated also. If you do it, so we were talking about science being proper. You're refuting hypotheses, you're refuting your ideas, you're not confirming them. So ideally, your Nobody could actually prove that your lipid hypothesis is correct. But you can refute the existing hypothesis. So you could prove that's wrong. And if you prove that's wrong and yours is the best explanation for what's left for both the experiment that proved it wrong and all the other evidence that's been accumulated since then people might accept your hypothesis correct. And in some bizarre alternative universe where software engineers in Vegas get credit by the scientific community for what they've done, bingo, Nobel Prize. That's after it may or may not be the same alternative universe where journalists get credit for doing meaningful
I'm sure
science.
we're both holding our breath.
Yeah, but it's sort of, in order to get to the point where your hypothesis is taken seriously, you are refuting the conventional hypothesis. I just had this discussion, I'm waiting on email. I've been going back and forth with one of the leading figures in the obesity community about how to test what's called the carbohydrate-insulin model versus the energy balance model.
That's where I wanted to go next.
Yeah, and we're making no progress in our discussion. And finally I said to him, because I keep giving him ideas and he keeps calling them rubbish. And this is crazy. I'm loading the deck, and that's, and then he explains why. And I finally, yesterday, sent him an email saying, look, I've been trying to figure out what's going on here. Like why we're making such little progress. And the reason is, I think, because you are trying to test, you want to test the carbohydrate-insulin model, which is the alternative hypothesis. And you want me to give you predictions that hypothesis that will either be confirmed or refuted in an experiment. But I don't believe we're testing the alternative hypothesis. We're testing the null hypothesis. You're always testing the null hypothesis, the conventional wisdom. In this case, energy balance that you get fat, because fat accumulation is determined by how much you eat. It's the simplest way to put it. That hypothesis can be tested because that makes specific predictions. If you don't change how much you eat, you don't get fatter. Unless your metabolism slows down, and you can measure that, so you're always, and if you look at the statistics you're using to calculate p-values and things like that, those statistics are based on the idea that you're testing the null hypothesis. In your world, the null hypothesis is that if LDL goes up, plaque formation increases, and you can refute that. But your own hypothesis, well, it's interesting because your own hypothesis would predict that plaque formation doesn't increase. Yeah, I guess you can refute that also. So
it's not that per se. It's whether or not so of course I've got to always caveat at a population level, right? Because the exceptions don't necessarily disprove the rule per se. I believe, to simplify mine, and then we'll move on to yours real quick, the lipid energy model posits that the high level of LDL cholesterol and high level of ApoB, the reason for them is relevant with regard to their likely association with atherosclerosis, if you're going to put the two together. In other words, how could I come to a conclusion that folks like myself could be running at super high levels of LDL and ApoB and not see a corresponding association of higher plaque development? And I believe that's because it's actually lipid physiology that is not impaired in some way. And that all of the data that we've been looking at, especially at scale, has had some version of an impairment that comes either from acquired disease like insulin resistance syndrome or something that you're born with, such as molecular familial hypercholesterolemia. But in all these versions, there's something that both alters the lipid profile and independently associates with atherosclerosis. So we always need to get a clean signal of just high LDL and ApoB and what I would suggest may be actually a physiologically functioning lipid metabolism when you're powered by fat. That's my high level version.
That was very well done.
Yeah,
you should talk about this more often.
Yeah, but I do kind of want to get I want to get your unpacking of the carbohydrate insulin model. But I'd like to actually start with where you were going with the energy balance model. And it's kind of fun because occasionally you suddenly go on a tear on Twitter and have like these big debates. I kind of want to start with you bringing out what's maybe appropriately called the tautology, that is the energy balance model. How is it that we know you were eating too few calories? Well, because you lost weight, right? Why is that a tautology?
I mean, you just said it.
Yeah.
Let me backtrack, because my next book is going to be on the history of obesity research, and the history of this energy balance thinking on one level, because it's fascinating. So in the 19th century, you kind of have this vague idea that people get fat because they eat too much or gluttons. But there are people who clearly suffer from obesity who don't eat any more than lean people. So they're always trying to explain that latter phenomena. The people who, the Falstaffs from Shakespeare, who are, gluttons and living large, we're willing to explain them as their obesity, that brought it on themselves. It's their behavior, they eat too much. But the rest of these people, the world is full of people who suffer from obesity but don't eat any more than lean people do. They don't seem to be particularly inactive either. A lot of them are poor and they do manual labor, and yet, boom, they're obese. So how do we understand them? And so the theory that was put forth is they must have a slower metabolism. Okay, because they have to be taking in more energy than they expend. They said thermodynamics was emerging as a major sort of science in the late 19th century, and people understood the law of conservation of energy. So if they're not eating too much, then they're expending too little, because they have to be a balance. And late 1890s, German named von Noorden sort of quantifies this in his obesity textbook. And one of the fascinating things about the history is your influence was determined by how far your writing was read. So if you were German writing in the German literature, which was sort of lingua franca of medicine back then, you could be read by the Germans and Austrians, and most of the Europeans read the German literature, but you wouldn't be read by the Americans or the British. But if your books were translated into English, you would be read by them also. So there was a real
literally the language barrier is
but definitively important, remarkably so. So von Noorden puts forth basically this energy balance hypothesis. It's either expending too much, or for those few people who have what they're calling endogenous obesity. So there's exogenous obesity, which comes from eating too much food from the outside world, and endogenous is some kind of internal dysfunction that makes you expend too little energy. And through the 1900s, clinicians, they have these calorimeters so they can measure energy expenditure, and they're trying to demonstrate all the various ways that obese people expend less energy, and they don't. They expend more because they're bigger. And they just one theory after another. It's basal metabolism. No, that doesn't work. Their basal metabolism's higher. Okay, well then it's specific dynamic action, how much energy they give off after they eat protein predominantly. Nope. It's a famous experiment with two brothers done by this guy Max Rubner, who's the most famous German biophysicist of the era. Rubner compares a lean brother to an obese brother. They're like 2 years apart, and the obese brother just expends more energy. That's just what they do. But he doesn't eat anymore, and yet he's obese, so they're always trying to explain this. And through the 1910s, well, the 1910s get disrupted first by World War I, and then by the flu epidemic, and so there's very little meaningful work done. And then in the 1920s, everybody goes back to work, and they start getting rid of the energy balance hypothesis. It's like it's not about energy balance, it's about fat accumulation. It's like fat accumulation, they now know it's regulated by hormones, it's regulated by the central nervous system. This nervous system directly stimulates this process of lipolysis, which gets fat out of fat cells. And they're accumulating anomalous observations that can't be explained by the energy balance idea. Like there's one called the progressive lipodystrophy, which is predominantly in women. They lose all their fat tissue above their waist, and then they become obese below the waist. So how do you explain loss of fat in half the body and excess fat in the other half by energy balance, by eating too much or exercising too little? So by the 1929 to be precise, the European world shifts. It's like we're done with energy balance. I mean, a few of the people are still saying there's still a few people out there who get fat because they just stuff themselves. But the other guys are saying, well, maybe this urge to stuff themselves is because their bodies are trying to get so fat. So we got to, you don't know. If they don't have some constitutional predisposition to obesity, it's not going to matter how much they eat, they're not going to get fat. So they have to have the constitutional predisposition that manifests through the endocrine system and the nervous system. And
so this was broadly believed in 1929?
By 1929, it shifts. So by the 1930s, it's broadly believed in Europe. Now, two things happen. First of all, after World War I, until World War I, the American doctors who were serious about science or medicine went to Germany or Austria to learn so they would spend a year abroad learning from the Germans and the Austrians. And that kind of comes to an end after World War I. So you begin to lose the German influence and the Austrian influence in the US. And the Germans and Austrians were doing the best science in the world back then, not just in medicine, but in chemistry and biology and physics. Like all these brilliant, sort of seminal scientists were mostly Germans and Austrians, some, Scandinavians, a few Italians, Frenchmen here and there, some Brits. Okay, and they start to lose their influence in the 1920s, and then the Nazi Party comes along in 1933, and this was the major proponents of this neuroendocrine fuel partitioning. So it's not about how much you eat, it's about what your body does with what you eat. Does it burn it for energy, or does it partition it to fat storage? So it's a fuel partitioning hypothesis is a predominantly Jewish hypothesis. The major proponents, with one exception, one is a Nazi sympathizer, the rest are all Jews. And 1933, they're done. I mean, the Austrians still get to publish, but they can't go to different conferences. And so this hypothesis vanishes. But reading this history, what's so fascinating is as soon as you read, and I've got all the American articles on obesity, I've got the German and Austrian ones, which I can now translate thanks to AI. I've got the textbooks and the monographs and even some unpublished conference proceedings. As soon as somebody says anything vaguely relying on the first law of thermodynamics, like ultimately obesity has to be caused by taking in more energy than you expend, or ultimately obesity has to result from taking in more energy than you expend, you know that they're going to get the wrong answer. That fixed idea is going to determine everything they think after that. And they're never going to be able to understand that you can have a physiological system that stores excess fat independent of how much you eat or exercise. And no matter what kind of examples you give them, I was just reading, so in 1933, one of the major guys involved is Julius Bauer, an Austrian, one of the founders of the field of genetics and endocrinology. He's written multiple textbooks and monographs. His thinking sort of shifts the world in 1929. And in 1933, he's traveling and he's giving a continuing medical education course in Switzerland, where he's trying to get people to understand. You could see him thinking, how do I get people to understand this? So he starts his lecture on obesity, talking about acromegaly, gigantism, giants, for all intents and excess of growth hormone causes people, animals, to be excessively large and have particular, strong jaw features. I mean, there are physical features that manifest with this disorder that's called acromegaly. And in 1921, growth hormone was isolated from the pituitary gland, so it could start doing animal experiments. And by the late 20s, there's a group of Americans who are doing experiments giving dogs growth hormone. So they start off, first one ever done is 2 English bulldog puppies from a litter. And when they're 4 weeks old, they establish 4 weeks, their growth curve is completely normal. They give one of the dog growth hormone injections, and that dog starts growing bigger and heavier than the other dog. And they comment that the dog developed a voracious appetite. And Bauer describes this experiment, and he says no one would think that the growth hormone makes the dog hungry. Rather, they would assume that the growth hormone makes the dog grow, and the process of growth needing fuel to both to create all the new tissue and to make it happen, that needing the fuel makes the dog hungry. And it's the same process that we're talking about with obesity. So even if somebody eats voraciously and are fat, that doesn't mean that they're fat because they eat voraciously. And it makes perfect sense. It's a beautiful metaphor. And yet, if somebody goes into one of Bauer's lectures thinking about the laws of thermodynamics, somehow say something about causality, they're going to come out of it thinking the same thing. This is just going to wash over them, and it won't get to settle into the soil of their brains because their soil has been polluted by this idea that the energy balance tells you anything about obesity. Funny story, just we'll get back to the tautology. In a second paper that these Americans wrote, one of them was Cushing's, and Cushing's disorder is a disorder of basically acromegaly. They do a review of the field, and they say, we made a mistake when we started with the English bulldogs, because bulldogs kind of look like they have this weird jaw thing going anyway. So they kind of look a little bit like creatures with acromegaly even before you do the experiments. So we have to, instead, we did them on like, a greyhound and a collie and all these other dogs that didn't look quite so megalic, whatever the noun form is. So yeah, the idea is if any system gets larger, gets more massive, it has to take in more mass or more energy than it expends, okay? Because you can't create energy from scratch. So the idea is if somebody gets fatter and heavier and it's not, water weight, then they're taking in more energy than they expend. And from that statement, you then add causality. So taking in more energy than you expend is a fancy way of saying you're overeating. Overeating associates with getting fatter. Therefore, overeating causes getting fatter. Therefore, anyone who gets fatter has to overeat. And you can study how much they eat, or you can force feed people and make them eat more, and they'll get fatter, and that proves your hypothesis. Okay? Except it doesn't, because you can't prove a hypothesis true. The tautology is when you're looking at people who are overweight or obese or getting overweight or getting obese, you don't actually know that they're overeating. You don't know how much they're eating. You don't know how much they used to eat. You don't know how much they're currently eating. You don't know how much they're going to eat. You don't know how much they eat compared to other people their same weight or their, different body composition. You just assume they're overeating because they're getting fatter. That's a tautology. So that, it's always...
That's the measurement itself.
The measurement itself is literally that they're getting fatter.
Right.
You determine the overeating. You decide that overeating makes them fatter. You measure their weight. You put them on a scale. Lo and behold, on Friday, they're fatter than they were on Monday. Therefore, they have overeaten. You've proven they overeaten, and now you can say that they overate. When you never actually even have to measure their weight, measure how much they're consuming, see if it changes, see if, again, when you go back to what the Europeans originally were trying to explain, it's how do we explain obese people don't eat any more than lean people? We could assume that they eat more than they did when they were lean because they weigh more, it takes more energy to move their bodies. If they are going to maintain their obesity, they have to be in energy balance. I mean, that's what maintaining your weight it means. You're in energy balance. So they must be eating more than they used to, but do they eat any more than lean people? And if we can find lean people who eat more than they do, the world is full of them, then how do we explain the fact that they're obese? But once you get into this overeating thing, you don't have to bother explaining it. The fact that somebody gained weight tells you they overate. You believe that overeating causes obesity. What else do you need to do? The argument discussion I'm having with this august obesity authority is, how do we refute that hypothesis? Well, if you believe that body weight is fat accumulation is determined by intake, that intake has to go up for fat accumulation to go up, then let's see if we could create a scenario by which fat accumulation goes up and intake stays the same. Or even better, I bet we can create a scenario where intake goes up and fat accumulation goes down. Okay, so with that, but to get there, I have to get him not just to understand the sort of tautological nature of the way he thinks and the different way I think about testing energy balance versus testing carbohydrate-insulin model. I have to get him to understand that I know what I'm talking about because I'm just a fucking journalist, right? So how do you get somebody who's got a PhD who's won all these numerous awards in the community, including awards named after people he probably doesn't even know what they did because he's not as aware of the history as I am, to understand that a journalist might know what he's talking about?
Well, obviously this is something else we have in common because I'm often in a room pitching to folks who have much more advanced degrees than I do on literally the subject that they are themselves going to conferences, getting CME on, and so forth. And you're right. It's part of the challenge is if you're not already aligned towards a particular way of thinking to set up that challenge, then it's like you have two major tasks. And the first one's typically the harder one. The harder one is to get out of that paradigm. For example, to try to steelman the position of those on the calories in, calories out energy balance, they would say, well, of course, fiber doesn't count as much. More of it will pass through. There's the thermic effect of food, things along those lines. But often I feel as though there's a kind of and the rest paradox that kind of is applied where, okay, we know it's an overeat because they gained weight. That gives us the interesting insights into wanting to find out what the nature of the calories are if they didn't match what our expectation of the weight increase would be with this other set of calories. But it's going to be one of those things I just mentioned.
Oh yeah,
it's going to be something that we have yet to discover. When in reality, like you said, which I think you mentioned was something Eric Westman also mentioned, it's what your body does with the food.
It's his phrase. Even though Eric, I'm constantly trying to school him on how to think like this, but it is his phrase.
Yeah, but it's relevant because for the same reason we work, take aside software networks, let's do something more relatable like a car, right? I've certainly had many cars in my time, and they have had states of their existence where they've broken down and they don't, say, hold the water in the radiator as much, or there's a problem with the way the gas is being processed. Mm-hmm. It's internal to the engine. And therefore, I can't just as easily say I've underfilled the gas tank because I'm getting less miles per gallon, right? Something changed with the engine that becomes relevant to the larger descriptor.
Yeah, wait, is this defending the energy balance? Or
no, this is defending that there is something relevant between our mouth and what the outcome is. So of course,
it's one of my, I reading the Germans and the Austrians because they were. Although now that I've extended, I found Swiss researchers doing interesting thinking, Swedes. they're going through, like, so when Kuhn, when he talks about paradigm shifting, talks about this sort of accumulation of anomalous observations. So you have a theory, and that theory explains what you see, but then people keep doing experiments, or they look out into the universe and they're looking at things and they say, wait, that doesn't explain this, it doesn't explain that, and it doesn't explain this, and you accumulate the classic way to think about this is if you believe that the sun rotates around the earth, and you believe that planets have to rotate in perfect circles because you have some belief in the beauty of a perfect circle. So astronomers used to believe this even after they put the sun at the center of the universe, at the center of the solar system. They assume that the planets rotate in perfect circles, but then there are things you can't explain when you look at the night sky, like retrograde motion, and planets seem to be going in one direction and then they seem to be going back and then they move forward again. So how do you explain that? And they start putting epicycles, which are circles on top of circles. So you've got the big unit, then you got a smaller, then you add these epicycles, and epicycles became a metaphor for complicating a theory to make it explain these anomalous observations that it couldn't explain otherwise. Then eventually you accumulate so many anomalous observations, so many epicycles, somebody comes along and says, let's just get rid of this. Okay, I got a better idea. The planets don't they don't orbit the sun in perfect circles, they do it in ellipses. And if you do an ellipse, all the anomalous observations go away and your paradigm is shifted. I think this was Kepler, but don't hold me to it. So your observation in, absence of plaque buildup in people with high LDL particle number is an anomalous observation that cannot be explained. In the obesity world, there are all these anomalous observations. Like I said, the progressive lipid dystrophy. How do you explain that? Lipomas, these fatty tumors, and sometimes painful fatty tumors. And there are actually disorders in the literature where people had symmetric fatty tumors on sort of on the same opposite sides of the body. They had the same kind of tumors, which suggested that somehow the central nervous system was involved in all this. And then there were
or heck, bring up type 1 diabetes. You could eat all you want.
Yeah, except that because you're losing sugar in the urine, they could say it's still energy balance, right? Because you're losing urinary sugar, so the energy is going out instead. You come in and it doesn't go out. But yeah,
But ultimately, there does necessarily need to be a recognition. Getting back to the car analogy, that there's differences within the engines. You can't treat all the cars the same.
On some levels you can, and on some levels, on some levels you can. You have to figure out which they are all the same and which they're not. They all have tires, for instance, and they go flat, even Teslas. So far, it's.
But I guess.
But let me tell you my favorite
Yeah,
example of this. So because I recently found these photos online. Like I said, the internet. I was afraid when I wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories. It took me 5 years, and I collected more evidence, more papers than anyone had ever gone through. I'm convinced I knew more about the history of these fields than any human alive by the time I was writing that book. And I used to I'd download references and I'd send them off I had kids in Boston and LA and New York who would go to their local medical school libraries and Xerox them for me, that get the volume and hold it over this copy machine.
Days.
And I thought eventually it's all going to become available online, and the book would take forever. I would never stop doing research, and that's actually happened, and it's a problem. I have days where I say, okay, today I'm going to read these 4 papers and annotate them, and I get to paper 2 and I see a reference I didn't know about, and I can pull that reference, and then maybe I have to translate that reference, but it doesn't matter. And now that reference has references. And now I'm down a wormhole on a day where I was supposed to get 4 papers annotated. Instead, I now have 12 papers that have to be annotated, 8 of which I didn't have when the day started. So it's sort of an infinite regression, but it's fascinating. I love this. So there's a case that's reported in the literature, it's around 1913 or 15, of a young girl who, when she was young, had a bad burn on the back of her hand. So they did a skin graft from her stomach and put it on the back of her hand. And now it's 15 years later, and she's 30 years old and she's obese. And there's a photo of the back of her hand, and there's this huge puff of skin. So it's like normal wrist, huge puff of fat, normal fingers. And they say, look, this is crazy, because she's now fat here too. So whatever it is that determines whether or not this skin was going to get fat could be moved from one part of the body to the other, and is dependent on the fat tissue, and then depend on whatever hormonal signals the fat tissue is receiving. It can't just be energy balance, because you can see in the other tissue is an accumulating fat. So there has to be something unique to the tissue. And it's funny, I found 2 photos of the same patient, and the second is even, I mean, it's bizarre. And when I wrote, I think it was Why We Get Fat, I had some of these types of photos in my book, Why We Get Fat. My editor made me throw out half of them. He said it's beginning to look like a, pardon the expression, a freak show. And this is a self-help book. This book, I'm going to have a conversation with them, because I want these photos in there. I want people to be able to recapitulate the experience of these Germans and Austrians, where they said, this cannot be explained by energy balance.
I think you need to, because I really do think people just are taking the simplistic view
Right.
over and over and over again with regard to obesity. And the partitioning alone, the story behind it's really quite fascinating.
Well, this is what, it's just, as this is going on, for instance, there are other researchers, they notice that when people have spinal cord injuries, they tend to get obese below the waist. Depends where in the spinal cord, by the way, it's broken. So they'll be lean above the waist and obese below, and yeah, it could be physical inactivity because now they're bedridden or in a wheelchair, but why does it stay lean above the waist? So then, of course, being scientists, they start repeating this in animals, so breaking vertebrae in frogs or dogs in various places, or even severing the nerves that run to one leg but not another in a frog, and demonstrating that the frog, that leg that had the nerve severed, got fatter than the leg that had the nervous system intact. Nothing to do with how much energy that leg is expending, but the inability of the leg with the nerve severed to basically get fat out of the fat tissue. And so all this research is being done, and they're putting together this beautiful picture of the regulation of fat storage and fatty acid mobilization from the fat, and then how those fatty acids are used for fuel, and when they're turned into ketones, and this beautiful picture. And it all vanishes with the Second World War. This completely vanishes. In post-war, all these young American researchers flood into the field. They come back from the war. NIH is kicked up. There's now agencies to fund their research, and the only people they're reading are the Americans, who are saying it's gluttony and sloth. It's gluttony and sloth. Still in 1940, it's gluttony and sloth. We could disprove any other hypothesis. They pay no attention to the anomalous observations, because if you acknowledge the existence of those, your hypothesis looks shaky. And instead, they look at their experimental evidence that they've generated, where the poorly designed tests of the wrong hypothesis, in effect. And then everything after that is all energy balance. And by the 1960s, psychologists have come into the field and are dominating the research in obesity and eating disorder. And now, 60 years later, we say obesity is not an eating disorder, but it's caused by eating too much, and it's caused by eating too much ultra-processed foods, and ultra-processed foods are addictive, but it's not a behavior.
It did. Here's the thing I've remarked on many times before that definitely has a lot of crossover here. When I started out, I knew that it was appreciated when the hypothesis was simple and easy to understand. It's appreciated. We like that. What took me literally years to really get is that we're kind of wired to desire for things to be simple. It's not just that it's easy to understand, it's that we want it to be easy. And we like if the problem is easy and the solution is easy. Easy to understand on both sides. In the case of obesity, yeah, that's all I've ever grown up with. There was never any complexity beyond eat less and move more.
Well, this is what, that's what I grew up with. That's what I believed. And so this is where the importance of experience comes in. When I talked about how we can convince people to rethink diet and health if they have health problems, but you cannot convince a lean and healthy person to do it because they have nothing that they could see, nothing they could experience that'll make them feel better. So, my personal experience, I was a mediocre Division II football player, Ivy League football player, so I could have been good, but we won't get into that. I could have been a contender. But I was big. I was always big. First of all, I have an older brother who was taller than I was and leaner than I was, always leaner than I was. I was always thicker than he was. He ate enormous amounts of food. I ate enormous amounts of food. So I had this experience, which seems to me obvious, that people are just built differently. Some people accumulate fat, other people don't. My brother, nothing he could do could get him to accumulate fat. Me, I could do it effortlessly. My nickname, because my last name is Taubes, people called me Tubby when I was 11 years old. It was like we were just different. It wasn't about how much I ate or how much he ate. We both ate as much as we could, as much as our mother would cook, and back then you ate family style, so there was always enough for 2 or 3 helpings. He ate enormous amounts and stayed ludicrously lean, and I ate enormous amounts and became thicker. He went on to become a rower and a distance runner. I went on to become a football player. It's like anatomy, it's destiny. So as a football player, by my senior year in college, I could get up to 240 pounds. I'm 6'2". Okay, I'm eating constantly. We would, breakfast, lunch, and dinner were cafeteria lines. You could get as many portions as you want. And then we would go at 11 o'clock at night to the diner across the street and eat 1,000, 1,500 calories worth of sandwiches. I still wish were there if this diner still existed, okay? They were delicious. It's just what we did. And doing all that, I get to 240. And then football ends, I get back down to 210. Pretty much just eating less. And then over the years, I slowly drift back upward. So by 1992 or so, I'm maybe 1993, I don't know, I'm maybe 230. Again, 2 pounds a year. And you try low-fat diets, because that was a norm. I actually met this guy, lived in LA, a physical trainer who was training one of my friends, who was the single healthiest human being I'd ever seen. And he said, go on this low-fat diet, you'll lose 6 pounds in the first 2 weeks, you'll never, regret it. So I did. Probably 20% calories from fat. There was no oils, no butter, no nothing. Just grains, skinless chicken breasts, vegetables.
A very dry diet.
Awful. But I lived by this for years. Okay, I lost 6 pounds in the first 2 weeks. Thought this is terrific, looked great, and then I slowly gained 2 pounds back every year until by 2000 I'm 235. And now I do Atkins as an experiment. I was writing about saturated fat and heart disease for the journal Science, and I was also doing a story for Discover on the mathematics of the stock market. As a freelancer, you had to do, always had multiple stories at work. So I go up to MIT to interview this guy who runs the Laboratory of Financial Engineering for the Discover story, and what he's trying to do is figure out whether traders like Warren Buffett are brilliant or just the tail of the distribution of being very lucky. You know, like a poker player.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be a
There's gonna be some
distribution
outliers.
of luck, and there are going to be people who just look brilliant, but they've really just been lucky all those years. And how do you tell them apart? You have to be able to, you know, assess what the distribution looks like, and then try to figure out, you know, how far away from the norm Buffett is. What can I really, how much can I really explain his benefit by his intellect? And so we start talking about good science and bad science, and I tell him about the piece I'm doing for Science magazine on dietary fat and heart disease. And he says, oh, if you're writing about fat, you got to try Atkins. He's Asian American. He said, look, I did Atkins. He said, my collaborator was at Wharton. His father did Atkins and lost 200 pounds. So I tried it. I lost 40 pounds effortlessly. And he said, basically, I just stopped eating rice. So at this point, I lived in LA. I wasn't married. I didn't have children.
And
My mother had passed away. My father had passed away. It's like if I kill myself doing Atkins, my cats are going to be homeless. But other than that, it's not a great. So I did it and lost 25 pounds effortlessly in like 6 weeks.
And you were literally low fat right up until you started?
Right up until I started.
Wow.
I mean, I still have the instruction. I ate the same thing every day. I'd buy pasta for lunch, and I'd look and say, God, it's 800 calories of pasta I got to eat to be satisfied. And then I would put fresh salsa on it, because fresh salsa has no fat, and it's just vegetables and it's oil and salsa. I don't even think so. Same thing every day for years and years and years. And again, you don't really know. Maybe it's working, and I'd be 270 if I didn't eat it. There's no way to tell. But Atkins, boom, I'm living in LA, I'm working out an hour a day. It's like I'm running 6 miles or rollerblading 20 miles, or, you know, this is doing these famous sand dunes, and my weight is just going up. And then you do this diet and you seemingly get to eat as much as you want. There's a chain of Argentine restaurants in LA, or there used to be, I don't know if it's still there, Gaucho Grill. And it's where screenwriters could go and eat meaty diets and afford it. And I'd go with my friends, and they'd get the skinless chicken breasts and the salad, and I'd get this appetizer of melted provolone cheese with sausage, and then a steak. And I'd say, this is my health food, because I was joking. I had no idea what was going to happen to my heart or anything like that, but it's like the weight just went away. It was an experience that was definitely informed my thinking. I mean, if I had done Atkins and had a heart attack, that would have affected my thinking. If I'd done Atkins and lost nothing, that would have affected my thinking. The fact that I had such a remarkable experience informed my perspective, so that I was open to the clinical trials that also replicated my experience and other people. It was an experience I could have because I was overweight. Then people can't have that experience. So that experience I could have that could open my mind to the idea that, and because I seemed to be eating more than ever, I had been on a diet my whole adult life. I mean, ever since football ended. I knew what it was like to lose weight by calorie restriction. I used to joke when I lived in New York, I would do this on occasions. I was working at Discover Magazine, which is in Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, and I'd go on these, I'd restrict calories to try and get my weight back down. And I'd go out to lunch with my friends, and I'd get, we'd be sitting in some, midtown diner, and I'd get a scoop of chicken salad on lettuce, and that would be my lunch. And then I'd be staring at someone else's plate, like the woman sitting at the table next to me, until she would go, do you want it? And it's like, I'm sorry. I mean, I know what it's like to have continuous thoughts of food, intrusive thoughts of food, because that was life for me as an adult on a calorie-restricted diet. It's entirely different on Atkins. I mean, aside from the fact that I'm not ordering an ice cream scoop full of chicken salad, I'm getting the biggest steaks they have. and I'm losing weight. And with this provolone sausage appetizer that, I used to joke, I expected to die of a heart attack any second. But as an experiment, it was invaluable in teaching me what was, it's a different phenomena than losing weight by calorie restriction. But if I argue that to an energy balance people, or anyone who says the key to weight loss is losing weight, is eating less, it's like they're not going to believe me. And then the world is full of people like my buddy Peter Attia, who now says the key to weight loss is eating less. And I think that's like, are you crazy? You did this too.
To speak to that experience, I didn't actually realize my whole life how much I was thinking about food ahead of meals. There was, the term food noise. I know it kind of gets used a lot, but there's legitimacy to it in that as I'm gaining weight, I don't know about you, I kept thinking, well, almost everybody my age seem to all just be gaining weight.
It's just natural.
It just comes with getting older.
Your metabolism slows down.
Right. I would hear that over and over again. The metabolism slows down. And then at the same time, occasionally I would be chatting with somebody who I would consider a health nut. Right. They'd be on whatever diet, whatever journey they are. And the health nuts would always point back to past pictures. They would go, yeah, look at what the crowds look like back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, et cetera, et cetera. And you'd go, yeah, well, I don't know. I can't think about it right now. Where are we going to go for lunch? And it'd be like 9:30, right? We'd already be talking about where we're going so that I could have that in my mind. And after I started doing LCHF, because keto wasn't that big in 2015, it was amazing. It wasn't just that I could eat as much as I wanted and just be full, but I just didn't have to think about it for hours.
Right. And that's almost the first phenomena you observe. It's also one of the reasons why, they talk about this with Wegovy, Ozempic, semaglutide, GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs. Food noise goes away.
Right.
So the idea is those drugs somehow get up into your brain and they suppress your food noise receptors. But I want to say, well, that's interesting, and I've said this because in keto, food noise goes away. First time I ever wrote that was 2011 when Steve Finney, I think, used that phrase or phrase very similar to describe what happens on ketogenic diets. Like your food noise goes away, your intrusive thoughts of food. And the reason we have intrusive thoughts of food is because we're always hungry. And we're always hungry either because we're calorie restricting, trying to keep our weight from getting higher, or our weight is getting higher. There's multiple ways to explain that phenomenon. But then the question is, what quiets the food noise? And I'm going to assume it's the same thing in both because that's the simplest possible hypothesis. And because in ketogenic diets, you don't have all these GLP-1 receptor agonists floating up towards the brain to suppress these neurons. But what you do have is changing in fuel partitioning in the periphery such that you're mobilizing fat and burning it for fuel, and fat oxidation is going up. And there's an entirely other theory of hunger that exists outside the obesity world by people who actually studied hunger, and that's that if you, in effect, feed the liver and produce ATP, the molecule that we use for energy, so as ATP generation goes up in the liver, that inhibits hunger and appetite, and so maybe in both the drugs are doing that, which means the GLP-1 drugs are also changing the fuel partitioning in the fat tissue, and there are experiments you could do to test all this, but the world is so convinced, so what they do is get people to eat less, because what they see is weight loss in association with eating less, and they assume that eating less causes weight loss, and so they don't have to explain the weight loss, they only have to explain the eating less, and that's what the drugs must be doing. How do you get them to think differently? Can we take a break?
Yes. So this brings us around to the actual carbohydrate insulin model itself. How would you describe it?
It's the dietary implications of the bigger hypothesis, which is this fat-trapping, fuel-partitioning hypothesis. We're going to get rid of this idea that obesity is caused by overeating because overeating has no meaning and energy balance is, just tautological. And we're going to assume that the same thing that makes fat cells fat makes people fat because people are the accumulation of their fat cells. And fat tissue storage is determined by neuroendocrine. So basically your nervous system, which stimulates lipolysis, gets the fat out of the fat tissue in the form of fatty acids, so it could be used for fuel. And insulin is the hormone that dominates storing storing the fat that you eat as fat. As long as insulin's elevated, your fat cells will hold on to the fat that they've stored. And so there's this balance between insulin storage and basically the CNN, the nervous system, trying to get them out. And obesity is a dysregulation of this system, such that too much fat is stored. So it's either the hormonal and endocrine dysregulation or a CNS, central nervous system dysregulation, or some combination of both. That's sort of the simplistic way of thinking of this fuel partitioning theory. So you eat food, the nervous system and the hormonal responses determine what you do with that food, whether you use it for energy or store it, and that system is dysregulated, so you're storing too much as fat. There are actually glycogen storage disorders where you're storing too much as carbohydrate, as glycogen. This is a fat storage disorder. You're storing too much as fat, and because of that, your body's getting heavier, so you need more energy. So if you're trying not to eat more, you're hungry all the time. And so you're kind of starving your lean tissue to put fat in your fat tissue. Your body is making that decision. Because insulin is a dominant hormone involved, we secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrate content of our diets. So right there, you would have a hypothesis that if the carbohydrate content of our diet has changed over the past 150 years, you would assume that the prevalence of obesity and overweight would change with it. Or let me rephrase that. The prevalence of obesity and overweight has changed dramatically over the past 150 years, and diabetes, which is also a disorder of insulin signaling. And it happens to coincide with the change in the quality of carbohydrates we've consumed, not necessarily the quantity, but the type. So with the Industrial Revolution, you get the machine processing of grain and of sugar, and you get this explosion in highly processed grains and sugars, which the biochemistry tells us will have an effect on insulin secretion and insulin resistance. And so carb content changes, insulin goes up. If insulin goes up, that's going to change this balance of lipolysis. Basically, it's going to change how much fat you store. There are other areas. So in doing my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, one of the reasons I focused on this hypothesis is that so many areas of the research led to this hypothesis. So you had research in heart disease, dominated by Jerry Reven at Stanford, implicating metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and heart disease risk. And so heart disease also increases in populations in association with this increase in metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is a disorder of insulin resistance for all intents and purposes. So you have high levels of insulin. You have low HDL, high triglycerides, you have fat accumulation, your waist size is getting bigger, your blood pressure is going up. So that implicated the carb content of the diet in heart disease risk and in insulin resistance, which linked to body weight through all this research that had been done, again, primarily by these Germans and Austrians linking insulin to fat accumulation. You've got type 2 diabetes, which is a disorder of insulin resistance primarily. So insulin resistance, high levels of insulin, high blood sugar associates with overweight and obesity, associates so closely that Elliot Jocelyn, who was like the god of diabetes in the first half of the 20th century, says diabetes is the penalty for obesity. You pay for being obese. Because so many obese patients become diabetic, and so many type 2 diabetics we now know are overweight and obese. You've got populations throughout the world that are experiencing these nutrition transitions, and they're being followed by primarily, in this case, British physicians. The British, because they had the British Empire all around the world, had missionary and colonial physicians scattered all around the world. And they were all seeing a very similar phenomena, which is as the populations they were administering to became westernized, as they came into contact with traders and with merchants, these conditions, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, that they only saw in the Caucasian population were now seen in these traditional, whether they were the South American Indian populations, North American Indian populations, First Nations people, South Pacific Islanders, Asia, anywhere you went in the world, you've got this nutrition transition from whatever the traditional diet is to a Western diet. You see that transition associate with epidemics of obesity and diabetes. And back then, that nutrition transition was primarily white flour and sugar. Those were the things that were easy to ship around the world, that the natives were happy to buy, that these traditional populations were happy to buy and eat. So you had this field of physiological psychology, which is this field, this idea that fundamental human behaviors are determined by physiological states. So hunger is a response to energy deficiency in the body. Your body is, your brain is eating to satisfy the energy needs of your body. Thirst is responding to changes in water balance in the body. And this is a field of research that begins more or less with Claude Bernard, the great French physiologist in the 1860s, the concept of homeostasis. Walter Cannon at Harvard in the 1930s, who coins the term homeostasis. These people are trying to understand thirst and hunger, because these are fundamental behaviors, in effect, or you respond to them with behaviors. And they do so basically with a hypothesis that implicates fuel partitioning in the periphery. If I mentioned this, if your liver is being fed and is generating ATP, these molecules that we use for energy, then the hypothesis that came out of this is that inhibits, basically your brain is monitoring your liver's energy state. And your liver is serving as a sense organ of fuel availability in the periphery. All the foods you eat and the foods you mobilize from storage all pass through the liver. So protein does, carbohydrates, it's all metabolized there on some level, and your liver knows how much fuel is available, and then that signals to the brain through the nervous system again, up the vagus nerve, or through hormonal signals that we either have enough energy or we don't. And the fuel supply in the liver was again going to be determined primarily by insulin and other hormones. So you had these whole series of, as I was doing my research, I was moving from one discipline to the next, and I kept stumbling on the same hypothesis manifesting itself in different ways. So like in nutrition, from the now I know from the 1797 onward to 1921, when insulin was discovered, the treatment for diabetes was a basically ketogenic diet. They called it the animal diet. It was fatty meat and green leafy vegetables. More fat, the better. Actually, I was just reading something on the flight over where a German was talking about how everybody kept trying to put too much protein in the diabetes diet. This was like in the 1890s, but they didn't differentiate between type 1 and type 2 back then. And if you wanted the ideal type 1 diet, you wanted to keep protein low also.
Because it has a little bit of a glycemic impact.
The 61% of the amino acids are converted into glucose, and that'll stimulate insulin secretion. You don't have insulin to deal with it if you have type 1 diabetes. So in diabetes, this was standard of care until insulin was discovered. And in obesity, beginning in 1825, Anselm Briat-Savarin, the French lawyer and gourmand who wrote the single most famous book ever written about food called The Physiology of Taste. It's been in print for 200 years. Talks about interviewing all the fat people he meets, 500 or so conversations he's had over the years, and he comes to the conclusion that they all crave bread and potatoes and sweets, and that if you don't want to be fat, and he talks about his own struggles with his weight and how he's kind of won out over it by abstaining more or less rigid abstinence from, he called it the farinaceous elements of the diet, but that was carbs. 1865, the first worldwide diet craze by Banting Banting's a British undertaker who is obese his whole life. He tries everything. He tries starving himself. He tries exercise. It just makes him hungry. He tries rowing on the Thames. It doesn't do any good. Finally, he goes to an ear doctor named Harvey, who he's having hearing difficulties, and Harvey's fatty accumulations in his ear. Harvey has been to Paris, where he's heard Claude Bernard lecture about glycogen storage and insulin, and anyway, not insulin, wasn't discovered then.
Just a little aside, by the way, I don't know if you've had a chance to look when the American Diabetes Association not too long ago was putting out new materials, and I was getting a bit frustrated by where they were taking it. I went, because I was curious, I looked all the way back to when they started. And if you look at the founding physicians, especially the main physician, you can find in his book what he was recommending for foods. It actually stands up pretty well to being a low-carb diet today. So a lot of what you were saying in this interview seemed to be very suggestive that there was that awareness of the carbohydrate relevance.
Well, they knew, and everything goes off the rail because of the cholesterol theory and heart disease in the 60s. But they knew that the insulin was a response to the carbohydrate content of the diet, but they were afraid even in the 20s. And this gets into, let me finish this one theme and then we could get to the, anyway, so 1865, Banting basically, he's put on a very low-carb diet, a lot of alcohol in it. I mean, it's crazy back then, but like, the alcohol was safer to drink than water in the 19th century. There's no way to get around that. Anyway, he loses like 40, 50 pounds. He writes a pamphlet about it. The pamphlet sells out. He does numerous, it's all around Europe and the U.S., people are going on Banting's diet, including kings. And it becomes basically the standard of care on obesity through, again, the 1930s, when it kind of begins to evaporate because, somebody comes along and looks at Banting's diet and says it's just a low-calorie diet. It's something I have not been able to establish who did this first. But when you're reading these monographs on obesity, monographs are basically textbooks written by one person. They list Banting's diet and all the diets that copied it with variations on, more fat or a little less fat as low-calorie diets. Somebody calculated this is only 1,200 calories, so we could say that they're energy-balanced diets. And this really screwed up the field. Because even the people who understood fat as a sort of neuroendocrine partitioning disorder still ended up having to say the way to treat it is to get people to eat less, because that's all we've got. But they didn't realize that eating less by eating fewer carbs and eating less by eating fewer calories were different things stimulating different neuroendocrine responses. So yeah, and the diabetes world, it's just, the insulin was the first problem, but as early as the 19 teens and 20s, they suspected, Jocelyn thought that dietary fat caused atherosclerosis and diabetes. And he talked about killing his own patients, by feeding them high-fat diets, because the diabetics were so likely to die of heart disease. But again, they didn't know the difference between type 2 and type 1, and once they had insulin and stopped giving them high-fat diets, they were loading them up with insulin, and so basically causing metabolic syndrome along with the type 1 diabetes, or the other.
Along with heart disease.
Along with heart disease. But they didn't think of it like that. And I go into detail. And
You're actually in our documentary. We have you as part of the interview,
okay,
where you discussed that this was a commonality. It seemed certainly life-changing for them to have exogenous insulin for type 1 diabetics.
Yeah.
But initially they were getting very large doses and dying of atherosclerosis much earlier in life than everybody else.
Right. Yeah, and it's just, again, I may have mentioned this, the late Richard Kahneman, who in his great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about this concept of Wysiati, W-Y-S-I-A-T-I. What you see is all there is. And of all the insights in his book about cognitive psychology and how our brains tend to deceive us, this was the thing I found most profound, because you're trying to understand how people are coming to various decisions or conclusions based on that seem incomprehensible to you, you've got to understand what they're saying. And if you can understand what they're seeing, you can understand why the conclusions they're coming to are reasonable, rational conclusions from their perspective. And we see this now with the political divide, because as soon as you sort of drift into liberal or conservative or, Democrat / Pinko versus Trumper, you change your source of information and who you trust. So if you read the New York Times, you'll have a different worldview about politics than if you read the Wall Street Journal. And I'll bet you we could do a randomized controlled trial where we take, 1,000 17-year-olds who had never thought once about politics and randomize them to either the liberal New York Times or the conservative mainstream Wall Street Journal as their source of information. And 15 years later, you'll have entirely different political views based only on their source of information. What they see determines how they think about the world, and what they see is different. So, and the same is true in science.
I really do think that that's also just a key difference in the culture of engineering. I mean, not even just literally the culture itself, is that there's kind of this expectation of greater complexity outside of our awareness, or for that matter, control. So there's such an interest in trying to design things with that expectation in mind, such that you can make the things you don't know matter less. Right? Yeah, right, exactly.
Or won't kill someone else. Yeah, no, but again, it's funny, because one of the ways I often think of how people think differently, trying to understand, and this shows up in everyday life, my family, but some people, it's like you're wired to think about the implications of your thoughts. So if I do this, this happens. I tried to do it with you earlier, right? Because if you publish this without getting Snyderman's perspective prior to publication, you're going to be more likely to defend it afterwards than you would before, because the publication changes your perspective. It's like, what's going to happen if I believe this? What does that imply? And what is that implication going to mean? So if I do this as an engineer and I build this bridge and I don't take into account that, or there's another example, what's his name's, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
Donald Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld,
right.
Yeah. So it's sort of like, okay, we have to take into to account the known unknowns, but what about the unknown unknowns? If I'm building a bridge or a car or an airplane, it's the unknown unknowns that are going to kill people. How do we... You evolve a way of thinking that has to take into account what you know and what you don't, what you see and what you don't see, even though you can't see it, and what you don't even know you don't know, and that's the margin of error you're going to have to build into everything and still hope that you're accounting for. But as an engineer, your products of your work will be tested.
I mean, you hope so, but let's actually unpack that.
Well, I mean, they will be tested by the real world.
Right.
At some point, it's like in Oakland, where I live, there's a Bay Bridge that connects the East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley, to San Francisco through Treasure Island in the middle of the bay. And about 15 years ago, when we moved out here, they rebuilt the Bay Bridge because the old one wasn't expected to survive the next earthquake that this local Hayward fault will have sooner or later. So it was an old bridge. They tore it down. They built a new one, then tore down the old one. It was very cool to watch all this. And the idea is that the new one will survive the Hayward fault when it goes off. That will be the test. There's no way to get around it.
Right. Okay, so
and that's so it's sort of
this
you
is,
just hope that these people.
Okay, yeah. So let's use my paper in Snyderman because I think it's a great example. And that concludes part 1 with Gary Taubes. Part 2 is on its way, but before you go, be aware that there's only one thing paying the bills for this podcast, and that's us, Own Your Labs, which we'd like to keep that way. And as long as the podcasts are getting promoted by you and we keep getting a lot of business coming in for private blood testing service with Own Your Labs, we hope to keep it that way. So without further ado, here's a teaser for the next episode.
Mr. Taubes, is it fair to say that one subtext of your talk is that we are all idiots? I'm like, yeah, that's fair. But I can't say that, right? So but it was exactly the right question. But the conventional wisdom is no fruits and fresh fruits and vegetables, scurvy, death. Okay, test it. Why don't they want to? Because they're not scientists as I understand the word. Palatable means good tasting, right?
Yeah.
Hyper means a lot.
Yeah.
Well, there's a problem with the science as soon as they're using terminology like that.